very good afternoon to everyone. Warm welcome to the second panel of the third session of today's program. My name is Storey, and I'm a senior fellow at the ICIS Yusof Ishak Institute. So the aim of this panel, as we've heard, is to try and divine the future of the ASEAN community beyond 2025, and in particular to assess some of the increasingly complex challenges facing the bloc. We've discussed a bit about US-China rivalry this morning, and perhaps in this session we can address the issue of the growing divide, or at least the perceived growing divide, between continental and maritime Southeast Asia, which actually has been quite evident of late in terms of the member states' approaches to both Ukraine and Myanmar. So to discuss this topic, I'm delighted to be joined by two very, very distinguished speakers with extensive diplomatic experience in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN, and indeed around the world. So our first panelist is Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh. Ambassador Vinh worked in Vietnam's Foreign Service for over 38 years, focusing on Vietnam's multilateral diplomacy and Vietnam's relations with Southeast Asia and the United States. He is the longest-serving ASEAN SOM leader for Vietnam from 2007 to 2014, and as Deputy Foreign Minister, Ambassador Vinh was instrumental in Vietnam's policy and participation in ASEAN at a crucial time, which included Vietnam's chairmanship of ASEAN in 2010. During his tenure as ambassador to the United States, he worked extensively to promote Vietnam-US relations, with successive visits to Vietnam by Presidents Obama and Trump, and the first ever visit by a Party Secretary General of Vietnam to the United States in 2015. Our second panelist is Dr. Marty Natalegawa. Pak Marty served as Foreign Minister of Indonesia from 2009 to 2014. He was Indonesia's permanent representative to the United Nations from 2007 to 2009. And before that, ambassador to the UK and Ireland. He is a member of the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation, UNSG's Advisory Board on Disarmament, and UN Institute for Disarmament Research Board of Trustees. In 2018, Pak Marty published with ICES a great book called Does ASEAN Matter? A View from Within. It's for sale outside in the lobby if you're interested. And he's one of the most respected foreign policy and international security thinkers in the region and indeed beyond. So without further ado, can I ask Ambassador Vinh to give us his thoughts on ASEAN post-2025? Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Storey, for your introduction, and certainly I feel privileged to be here to share with you at this important 37 ASEAN Roundtable. The topic of maritime versus continental divide in ASEAN, can we bridge the gap? I think we do recognize there's a divide between the mainland and the maritime countries, but that's not all the story of ASEAN. There are many other differences related to different issues and different points in terms in ASEAN. So all this will have an impact on ASEAN unity. And how we do with that? I think we need to look a brief look back into history of ASEAN that I can share with you now. First, ASEAN started since 1967, not as an organization or entity of maritime versus continental. At that point in time, it was more a result of a political will of a grouping of countries that need to do with the things confronting them, especially in maintaining peace and confronting conflicts. And then ASEAN evolved, and it has developed into a full-fledged throughout the times. For example, back in 1976, it adopted the TAC, and then we have a lot of networking with the partners. So ASEAN expanded its sphere of influence in the region and expanded its interactions, not with just within itself, but also with other partners. Then come the 1990s, from 1995 to 1999. We have Vietnam, and then Myanmar and Cambodia, and later Laos and Myanmar, and then later Cambodia joined in ASEAN. And I think at that point in time, it was from both sides, the newer members of ASEAN and the current ASEAN members, we have a decision made out of a political will to get all the 10 countries in Southeast Asia together in ASEAN. And certainly on economic integration, we make step-by-step forward in order to integrate ourselves, including on how we integrate the newer members into ASEAN economic integration, including from AFTA to the ASEAN Economic Community. This is very much important as we see. So we have what we call ASEAN unity in diversity. Differences we have, but starting point is that we are not maritime versus continental. For example, at the beginning, from 5 countries, we have 1 Thailand and the other 4 as maritime. Now we have an equal number of countries, 5 maritime and 5 continental. We differ from many things, but we have a lot of things in common. That's one feature. And the political will and the need to integrate ourselves economically and the need to work together for this one will be very much important for us. The second point I want to say is that when we expand our activities and interactions, especially with the outside world, we need to unite ourselves. We have many differences in approaching the dialogue partners and the issues around us, and including issues within the region, but we can manage to get into some form of consensus in dealing with this one. And certainly it's not an easy task. So that's why we need to work together. And that's why later on, Pham will be saying on how to harmonize between national and regional interests and perspectives. This is very much important. To me, ASEAN certainly in dealing with the countries in the region, with the issues in the region, and with partners outside the region, different countries may have different priorities. I call sub-regional perspectives and so affect the shaping of national interests. Countries in the mainland certainly will look more into cooperation within the on land and the borderlines, with less focus on the maritime issues. Countries in the maritime areas certainly will be focusing more on the maritime issues. But we can see some countries in between, countries like Vietnam also is that country. I will be dealing with this later on. We are on land, but we have a long coastal line, and we are looking very much towards the sea, and we are very much concerned about the sea as well. So it's a cost-cutting sub-regional interests and priorities. This is one feature that in ASEAN, if we develop projects and vision, we should look into that one as well. What I call is that to link, to connect, and to align the sub-regional interests, focus, and priorities in our common agenda, so that we can tackle the divide between the two groupings, sub-groupings within ASEAN. Now, on how we do it, I believe that in the past we have been able to bridge the gaps, to build the consensus, and we continue to do so because a number of things. Point number 1, all 10 ASEAN countries need ASEAN. Certainly, until now, we need more. Certainly, besides Myanmar is something special case, but all 10 ASEAN countries need ASEAN now. Point number 1, because of the difficult geopolitical challenges ahead of us, and because of the global economic uncertainties, all the two themes of the two sessions earlier this morning. And because of the challenges, we need to be together. Point number 2, when we are dealing with the major power, especially the major powers now are in rivalry. So we need to stick together and form a common point of view so that our voices and our interests can be heard and attended to. And point number 3, in economic terms, integration within ASEAN, even the percentage of our trade within ASEAN is about 23-24%. But that form a basis for us to start to expand our relationship collectively with other partners and individually with other partners as well. Now, another point is that all the partners of ASEAN, especially the major and important partners to ASEAN, they are very much focused on both the mainland and the maritime areas of ASEAN. But in strategic, geopolitical and strategic terms, they focus more on the maritime issue. This is a fact of life that we have to deal. So if countries in ASEAN on the mainland want to be heard, they have to work with the maritime countries in ASEAN. And vice versa, if maritime countries in ASEAN want to attract the support from mainland ASEAN, so we have to work together. This is how we need to align our interests to put on a common agenda of ASEAN. I promised to talk about Vietnam. Vietnam is a special case in point here. Vietnam is on the mainland, you know. We have borders with Laos, with Cambodia, and certainly with China. And throughout the histories, this neighborliness very much impact on our development and history of Vietnam, including also the interactions between Vietnam and the neighboring countries, especially with China. And China is now rising, and China is both an opportunity for development and also challenges for us in other cases. But Vietnam has long coastal line, more than 2,500 kilometers long, something like that. But we have maritime zone as well. We have competing claims and all these. And we need the South China Sea to be peaceful, to be safe, and to be secure, and with freedom of navigation. All these things we share with you. So we need both peace and prosperity on land, and also peace and prosperity at sea. This is why there will be a link if you get Vietnam into both the continental agenda and the maritime agenda. I will give you a good example is between Vietnam and Singapore. We have been working on a number of projects, including Singapore need land space. So we have established what we call VSIP, Vietnam Singapore Industrial Parks. A number of parks have been there, so Singapore can help build the basis for industry and businesses and invite businesses to invest in Vietnam through the channel of Singapore. This is very much good, and I think that will be continue to be. And a number of other initiatives also being tabled. For example, there's a proposal for using the electricity grid from Vietnam so that we can connect electricity and power from the mainland to the maritime countries, including Singapore. That has been proposed, and that will be very much good. So to conclude this one, I think that maritime versus continental divide is a fact of life. We have been dealing with this, but differences in ASEAN not just confined to this nexus. ASEAN has many other differences, but what we call ASEAN unity and diversity has been a fact of life, and we have been accustomed to, and through our history, we have difficulties, but we managed to go further forward. And what we need right now is that we need to do more, but we have basis to believe we can do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Vinh. Your points are well taken there, that although the ASEAN member states have different priorities and interests, there's more that unites them than divides them, and that at this time of growing great power competition, a unity is more important than ever. Thank you. Pak Marty, can I ask you to address the conference, please?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation to speak before such an august and informed forum. And I must once again apologize for not being able to join right from the morning, because I was in a forum just right across the hall here for another theme on Asia. I've been asked to share some of my thoughts on ASEAN beyond 2025. And I risk repeating what had been said probably throughout this morning and early this afternoon. So I will try to be as succinct as possible and hopefully benefit more from more direct questions, if there to be any. When I think about ASEAN post-2025, I would want to begin by reflecting on the past 10 years, so to speak. I mean, the period between 2015 and 2025, one would remind us how unpredictable the dynamics and the world around us and the region could be, and therefore any attempt to try to have a crystal ball anticipation, I think would be quite a folly, because one would never know what is to happen, let alone in the next 10 years, even in the next year. We can never be certain about what is to occur and how ASEAN should respond. And with that type of caveat, recognizing how uncertain and how fickle the situation can be, I think from the juncture of 2022, this year, especially from Indonesia, I assume for next year's chairmanship, I would want to identify at least two type of challenges that ASEAN post-2025 vision would need to respond to. Actually, in this case, I think it's not even post-2025, because it's a problem of here and now. It has to be front-ended. These are issues that can't wait to be worked on in the next 10 years after 2025, but I feel it has to be a here and now effort by ASEAN. One is one that I'm sure all of you have discussed all throughout this morning, is this arc of instability that we are confronting Southeast Asia looking out. From its west, for instance, at the risk of oversimplification, we see a very uncertain India-China dynamic, not only on its land border, but also in the maritime domain. Not often cited. We have to be wary as well of how, for instance, the Pakistan-India dynamic was to develop further up north. The repercussions or implications of a so-called no-limit partnership between China and Russia, whether this is a force for stability or otherwise. And of course, one turns further north to Northeast Asia itself, which is the very definition of uncertainty and instability in our Indo-Pacific. So many facets in Northeast Asia to dissect. The Korean Peninsula dynamics, North-South Korea, Korea, Japan, Russia, and added to all US obviously, added to all this is the technology and the weaponization that is now involved. In the past few days, we've seen repeated ballistic missile tests by DPRK, and even the prospect of another nuclear weapon test. Further down south, East China Sea, Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, even further to our west, the Pacific, which used to be relatively Pacific, is now seeing contests between China, Australia, New Zealand, and United States. In other words, I think without getting too deep into it, our environment for confronting ASEAN is a hostile one, is an inhospitable one, an arc of instability is how I would like to describe it. But what makes it especially challenging, we are confronting this situation not in our best of health in terms of ASEAN itself. ASEAN, obituary on ASEAN have been written many times over, and I'm not going to be too hasty in saying that we are at the period of the end of ASEAN as we know it. But certainly, this is certainly not a time for business as usual, because ASEAN, among others because of the current Myanmar situation, is now facing internal challenge unforeseen before, not seen before. Even at the previous heights of the Myanmar portfolio situation, ASEAN managed to manage the situation and maintain its status as a collective 10, externally united, internally pressurizing, prodding, pushing, encouraging, hand-holding all the various possibilities Myanmar to do the right thing. But now we have essentially the codification or the formalization of an ASEAN 9. We have an empty seat because, in my view, quite correctly, the junta does not deserve to be seated at ASEAN summits and other ministerial meetings. But still, we need to reflect on that, how long this can go on. That is why I think when we talk about ASEAN Post-2025, in a way, although on the one hand, it's a nice exercise, forward-looking and all that, I think at the moment, from 2022's vantage point, problem of the type that I mentioned, the geopolitical push and pull, and the internal implosion must be front-ended. They must be front-ended because other matters become secondary to this. These are, in my view, existential in nature and to ASEAN. And what worries me is if there is a sense of business as usual. We can go through the usual calendar of ASEAN summitry, and we can be efficient hosts of events, but I'm not sure to what extent we have been impactful. So, for instance, to turn to the geopolitical ones, I think, and I made this point so often that I apologize, especially to Pa Ong Keng Yong, if he's still here, but thankfully he's not here, I think. Yes, because otherwise he would have heard it for the upteenth time. But in my view, in my humble opinion, it is not enough for ASEAN to simply express concern about these geopolitical developments. It is not enough for ASEAN to express disappointment, to plea to be left alone, not to be forced to choose. Emotion is not policy. ASEAN must earn its relevance. So the question is, given the reality of geopolitical competition, and it's not only between US and China, I mentioned before India, China, all the Northeast Asian dynamics, which is driven by trust deficit, driven by territorial disputes and the like. How can we earn our relevance in such a setting, and especially bearing in mind the different foreign policy orientations that we all have? I honestly believe that notwithstanding the differences that we have as governments, as countries, ASEAN can rally around the notion of stabilizing the competition, strategic competition between the so-called major powers. Over the past 5 or 6 days, we've seen signals coming from Washington and coming from Beijing. President Biden said, among others, if I'm not mistaken, he says that they are not looking for conflict. On the other hand, Beijing, President Xi says they can get along. Total deafening silence from ASEAN capitals. I would have thought this evidence of fragile evidence of rapprochement between the two countries must be quickly seized upon by ASEAN member states, so that when we have three dips in the next several weeks. Thailand with APEC, Indonesia with G20, Cambodia with the East Asia Summit. This is a chance for Southeast Asia to actually make a difference in terms of changing dynamics. And yet, the things that are coming out from some of the capitals, the capital I'm most familiar with is Jakarta. The type of thing that's coming out is about attendance. Who is coming, who is not coming. But we are more than event organizer. We must make sure at every juncture, Cambodia, Thailand, and Bali, same choreographed message comes out. That the leaders, or all these leaders, must commit themselves to peaceful settlement of disputes. The problems that we have just now are not new problems. They are all historically, they have been with us for many, many decades. But they are new in the sense they have been renewed. So why is it that causes these problems to be renewed? Have we lost the wisdom to manage them? And so I would think in terms of the front-loaded priority must be efforts at stabilizing the geopolitical competition, whether it be a commitment to the non-use of force, which, by the way, we already started in 2011 through the Bali East Asia Summit principles, Bali Principles of the East Asia Summit, which is extrapolation of the TAC, but somehow have been allowed to live to be in advance, or a crisis management capacity. The risk for miscalculation in our part of the world is rather a serious one, or Taiwan Strait, on Korean Peninsula, South China Sea to some extent. But the crisis management capacity has been left to be, it has been, waiting for summits to be convened and for opinion to be expressed way as if you are driving using a rear view mirror. Things have passed us by and then we give a running commentary. I think we can do better than that. And the second one to do with the intra-ASEAN dynamic. I thought we don't have to talk about these things anymore when we adopted the ASEAN Community and began the process of ASEAN Community 2003 to 2015, because we were trying to put to rest the notion of sovereignty versus non-interference, etc. But somehow over the past 5-6 years, such matters as democratic governance and human rights, democratic principles have been left in a state of drift within ASEAN. And as a result, we have Myanmar where we are today. And now the cost of inaction by ASEAN is becoming obvious. I hope this internal, regional, or national, regional nexus can be returned back to equilibrium in the sense that it is not ill will. There is no ill will for countries to show interest and concern in one another's internal development, but this is something that needs to be sorted. Indonesia will chair ASEAN next year. I hope someone is sitting and thinking that there is more important issues than simply organizing the events, making sure who comes and where, but actually making policy difference and policy impact to our case. On Myanmar especially, obviously, I did say Myanmar must be front-loaded as a priority, priority 1, priority 10, 1 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30. To me, that has to be the first and foremost. We can't speak at the beyond the region level if internally in ASEAN we are imploding, and without the benefit of all the important and very, very knowledgeable individuals in this room, I feel that the process that ASEAN have been embarking on the past 1.5 years, there is a little bit of a missing link in the sense that I agree wholeheartedly with the notion of excluding the junta from the summitaries, which is, I think, important and necessary because there can't be a business as usual. But, however, when you have a meeting on Myanmar itself, the theme is not ASEAN summit discussing ASEAN connectivity, etc., etc. Myanmar specific meeting, like we did have a couple of weeks ago, a week ago. It is difficult to imagine to have a meeting on Myanmar without Myanmar parties being present. And I mean, so I hope there will come a time when we can think of some kind of a formula where not only do we have an empty seat, but we have the NUG and its and the other democratic partners invited, and the junta obviously has to be there as well, because if you have to find a solution, everyone must be around the table. No legitimacy is being conferred, but as well, it gives the junta the additional motivation that if they don't turn up, the seat don't remain vacant, but it will be seated by someone else, namely the democratic leaders of Myanmar. At the moment, I feel as if everything has been placed on the person of the special envoy, and as if responsibility have been contracted out to this one person's itinerary, trying to go back and forth, and whereas the 5 points, principles or consensus, there are a lot that ASEAN member states themselves can do to implement it, rather than just waiting for some kind of a permission or movement from the from Naypyidaw by the junta. But my thought again, beyond 2025, fantastic. Let's get on that business of finding priorities. But I'm afraid these are not normal times. We don't have the luxury of sitting around and then think about what the world will be like in 2025, when the world in 2022, 2023 is already imploding in the way that it is. And I hope ASEAN leaders and ASEAN ministers will apply their best efforts to this situation. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.